He thought he'd buried his brother years ago. He was wrong. He thought he'd given up on being a father. He was wrong about that too. Because on a Tuesday when the sun was high and the dust was settled, his brother's life came walking up his porch, and it was going to burn his world to the ground. The knock on the door was so faint he almost missed it. Henry Granger didn't get visitors. The woods were his neighbors. The wind was his only conversation. He opened the door, not with curiosity, but with annoyance. And then the world tilted. 4 of them. 4 children standing like little ghosts, carved from bone in desperation. The oldest, a boy, couldn't have been more than 12, but his eyes were ancient. The youngest was a bundle in her sister's arms, a wisp of a thing. The boy's voice was a rasp, raw from dust and thirst. "You're Henry Granger." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "Our pa, Daniel, he's your brother." Henry didn't breathe. Daniel. A name he hadn't spoken aloud in a decade. A ghost he'd worked hard to forget. "He said you'd help us," the boy pushed, stepping forward. He had his father's eyes, that same stubborn fire. Henry felt a lifetime of buried memories clawing their way up his throat. "Help?" The word tasted like rust in his mouth. The boy, Wesley, didn't flinch. "He didn't make it past Twin Ridge," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "He made me promise. He made me promise we'd get to you." Behind him, the second oldest, a girl named Rose, put a hand on his back. A silent, steadying gesture she'd clearly perfected over 1,000 miles of heartbreak. 4 of them. 4 starving, exhausted children who wore his brother's face. And in that moment, Henry's quiet, empty life was over. He stepped aside. The wordless invitation hung in the air, and they took it, filing past him into the gloom of his cabin. They tracked dust across the floorboards he hadn't swept in a week. They brought the smell of the road, of grief, of an ending and a beginning all at once. He shut the door, and the click of the latch sounded like a jail cell locking. His jail cell. He turned. They were huddled by the cold hearth, a tight knot of fear and loyalty. The youngest, June, let out a whimper, and that tiny broken sound shattered something deep inside him. He moved to the stove, his back to them. "I don't have much," he grumbled, his voice rough. "Stew from yesterday, some biscuits." Wesley just nodded, too proud to ask, but too hungry to refuse. They ate like wolves, silent, desperate, their eyes darting around the small cabin as if expecting it all to vanish. He watched how Wesley gave the biggest piece of bread to Rose, who tore it in half for little Lorna, who then pressed a crumb into baby June's hand. They weren't just a family, they were a unit, survivors. And his brother, the man Henry had written off as a lost cause, had taught them that. That night, sleep was a stranger. Henry sat on the edge of his bed, listening to the 4 small heartbeats that now filled the silence of his house. Daniel had sent them to him. His last act on this earth was to hand Henry the one thing he'd spent his whole life running from, a family. At dawn, he found them already awake. Wesley was trying to build a fire, his small hands clumsy with the big logs. Rose was brushing the knots from Lorna's hair with her fingers. They had slept on the floor, not wanting to presume on his bed. Henry frowned, a strange ache in his chest. "There's a spare room?" he said, gruffer than he meant to. Wesley just looked at him, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes flicked to a burlap sack he dragged in with him, tucked carefully in the corner. A sack Henry had noticed was tied shut with a complicated knot. "Pa said not to lose this," Wesley said, his voice low. "Said it was more important than food or water?" Henry stared at the sack. It was heavy, lumpy. What could Daniel have left that was so important? Money? Deeds to land that was probably long gone? But the way Wesley guarded it, with the ferocity of a dragon guarding its hoard, told Henry it was something more. Something dangerous. By midday, Henry knew he had to go to town. They needed everything: food, clothes, blankets. The town of Whitford was a small, tight-lipped place. A place where secrets were currency and gossip was the law. The moment he stepped into the general store, he felt the eyes on him. The whispers started like the rustle of dry leaves. "Thought he couldn't have kids. Daniels, I heard, dropped 'em on him like a sack of rocks. 4 of 'em. Lord, he can barely feed himself." Henry ignored them, his jaw tight. He loaded up on flour, beans, and dried milk. The bill made his stomach clench. The storekeeper, Mr. Barlow, peered at him over his spectacles, his expression a mix of pity and suspicion. "You sure about this, Henry?" "Taking on 4 is a heavy load." "Not about what I'm sure of anymore," Henry muttered, paying the man and hauling the supplies out. As he loaded his wagon, he noticed something. A man across the street leaning against the saloon wall. He wasn't a local, dressed too well. His coat was black, his hat pulled low, but he was watching Henry, watching with an intensity that made the hairs on Henry's neck stand up. The man met his gaze for a second, a flicker of something cold and calculating in his eyes. Then he turned and vanished into the saloon. Henry shook it off. Probably nothing, just a drifter. But the feeling of being watched followed him all the way back to the cabin. When he got there, the first thing he noticed was the mark, carved into the doorframe, right next to the latch. It was a simple symbol, like 2 crossed sickles. It hadn't been there that morning. He ran his fingers over the fresh cut in the wood. It was a warning. But from who? He thought of the man in town, the coldness in his eyes. He thought of the burlap sack Wesley was guarding, like his life depended on it. His brother hadn't just died. He'd been running, and whatever he was running from had just found its way to Henry's door. That night a storm rolled in, the wind howling like a hungry animal. The children were asleep, finally warm and fed. Henry sat at his table, the rifle across his lap, watching the door. The quiet life he had known was gone. He was no longer just a recluse. He was a guardian, a protector, and he had the chilling feeling that he was about to fail at both. Just as the fire began to die down, a knock came. Not faint this time. It was firm, sure. 3 solid raps that cut through the sound of the wind. Henry's hand tightened on the rifle. He rose, moved to the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't ask who it was. He just wrenched the door open, ready for a fight. A woman stood on his porch, a basket in her hands, snow melting in her dark hair. Her eyes were steady, kind, but held a shadow of some old pain. She wasn't the threat he expected, or maybe she was a different kind of threat altogether. "Forgive the intrusion," she said, her voice calm despite the storm. "Someone told me Henry Granger took in Daniel's children. I thought maybe he could use a hand." Henry stared at her. He didn't know her, but the smell of fresh bread was drifting from her basket, a scent so warm and comforting it felt alien in his house. "I'm May," she said, as if sensing his confusion. "May Ellis." She wore a simple dress and a black ribbon was tied around her wrist. A widow. "I knew your brother," she added, her gaze unwavering. "Not well, but I knew him. He passed by my farm a few weeks back. He looked hunted." Hunted. The word hung in the air between them, confirming Henry's worst fears. He looked past her, into the swirling snow, half expecting to see the man in the black coat emerge from the darkness. He saw nothing. He stepped aside, letting her in. She moved with a quiet confidence, setting her basket on the table and immediately taking charge of the kitchen as if she'd been doing it her whole life. She didn't ask where anything was. She just knew. Wesley appeared in the doorway of the spare room, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He looked from May to Henry, then to the burlap sack in the corner, his posture screaming defiance. "Who's she?" he demanded. "This is Miss May," Henry said. "She brought bread." "We don't need help," Wesley shot back, his eyes flashing. He was guarding more than just the sack. He was guarding his family. May turned from the stove, wiping her hands on an apron she seemed to have produced from thin air. She looked at Wesley, her expression soft but firm. "I saw that mark on your door," she said quietly. The air in the room went cold. "I saw it on a wagon. A black wagon that was following your father?" Henry's blood ran cold. It wasn't his imagination. The man in town. The mark. It was all connected. "What does it mean?" he asked, his voice low. May shook her head. "I don't know, but Daniel was scared of it. He told me if I ever saw it again, it meant they were close." "They?" Henry pressed. "Who are they?" But May just looked at Wesley, who had gone pale. The boy clutched the drawstring of the burlap sack, his knuckles white. Whatever secrets Daniel had left behind, they were in that sack, and they were about to tear this fragile new family apart. Later that night, long after the girls had fallen asleep to the sound of May's humming, Henry found Wesley by the cold hearth. The boy was holding a small, flat stone, turning it over and over in his hands. "You need to tell me what's in the bag, son," Henry said, his voice softer than he intended. Wesley's jaw tightened. "Pa said not to. He said no one could know. He said it would put us all in danger." "We're already in danger," Henry countered, gesturing toward the door with the carved symbol. "That mark is proof. Whatever is happening, we have to face it together." Wesley looked up at him, his eyes filled with a desperate conflict. "He made me promise," he whispered. It was his last breath. A promise. The boy was trapped between his father's dying wish and the terrifying reality of their situation. He was just a child, carrying a burden that would crush a grown man. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked behind them. May stood there, a quilt in her arms. She hadn't been sleeping. She'd been listening. "Sometimes," she said softly, her eyes on Wesley, "the best way to keep a promise to the dead is to protect the living." Wesley stared at her, then back at the dying embers in the fireplace. He seemed to shrink, the weight of his secret finally becoming too much. With trembling hands, he walked over to the burlap sack and slowly, painstakingly, began to untie the knot. The contents spilled onto the floorboards. It wasn't money. It wasn't deeds. It was a journal, a worn, leather-bound book, its pages filled with his brother's frantic, slanted handwriting. And tucked inside the front cover was a single folded piece of paper, a birth certificate, for Wesley, Rose, and Lorna. But not for June. There was nothing for June. Henry picked up the journal. The first page was dated 6 months ago. The entry was short, terrifying. "They found me. I don't know how. I have to run. I have to protect her. She is not what they think she is. She is everything." "Protect who?" Henry asked, looking at Wesley. Wesley's eyes flickered toward the spare room where his sisters were sleeping. "June," he whispered. "It was always about June." A week passed in a tense, fragile peace. May stayed, her presence a quiet source of strength that Henry hadn't realized how desperately he needed. She moved through the house with a gentle efficiency, turning the dusty cabin into something resembling a home. She taught Rose to knead dough, braided Lorna's hair, and sang soft songs to June, who had taken to her immediately, following her around like a little shadow. With Wesley, she was different. She didn't coddle him. She gave him chores, treated him not as a broken child, but as the young man he was trying so hard to be. And slowly, agonizingly, Wesley began to let his guard down. Henry spent the week reading his brother's journal. It was a chaotic, heartbreaking account of a man on the run. Daniel wrote of being pursued by faceless men in black coats, men who represented some shadowy organization he only ever referred to as the Institute. They weren't after him. They were after June. The journal was filled with cryptic references to her being special, a key, and the last one. But it offered no clear answers. Who was June, really? And why was she so important? The only certainty was that Daniel had faked his own death, hoping it would throw them off the trail long enough for Wesley to get the children to Henry. It was a desperate, foolish plan, but it was all he had. The quiet was shattered by the arrival of a letter. A man on horseback from town delivered it, his eyes wide with curiosity. It was official, sealed with wax, from a lawyer. Henry's stomach plummeted as he read it. It was from a distant cousin he hadn't seen in 20 years, a woman named Constance Eldridge. She was challenging his guardianship, but it was more than that. The letter was cruel, calculated. It spoke of Daniel's well-known instability in a history of family affliction. It painted Henry as an unfit, mentally unstable recluse who had essentially kidnapped his brother's children. It was a character assassination, and it was designed to work. "She's not just trying to take the children," May said, her voice grim as she read the letter over his shoulder. "She's trying to have you declared insane. That way, no one will ever listen to a word you say about men in black coats or secret institutes." It was a trap, a brilliant, terrifying trap. Constance wasn't the real threat. She was a pawn. The Institute was using the law to get to June. What do we do? Henry asked, the journal pages feeling like lead in his hands. May looked at him, her expression resolute. A man alone, a recluse, is easy to discredit, she said, her voice low and steady. But a family man? A husband? That's a different story. The law favors stability, Henry. It favors a home with a mother and a father. Henry stared at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. It was a proposal, not of love, not of passion, but of survival, a strategic alliance against a ghost army that was closing in on them. I'm not a good man, he said, the words tasting like ash. I didn't ask for a good man, May replied, her gaze never wavering. I asked for a man who will stand and fight. I'm asking if you're the kind of man who can stay. He looked past her, at the children playing by the fire, at Rose, who was humming a tune May had taught her, at Wesley, who was carving a small wooden bird, his brow furrowed in concentration, at June, asleep in a makeshift cradle, her face a mask of perfect peace. They were his. Somehow, in the span of a few short weeks, they had become his. He looked back at May, at the strength and courage in her eyes, and saw not a desperate widow, but a warrior. I don't have much to offer, he said. You have enough, she whispered. They were married 3 days later by the town reverend in a quiet ceremony in front of the cabin. The children were their only witnesses. Wesley stood beside Henry, stoic and serious. Rose held a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked. May held June in her arms as she said, I do. It wasn't a celebration. It was the drawing of a battle line. And as they stood there, a newly forged family under a vast, uncaring sky, Henry saw it. On the ridge overlooking the cabin, a glint of sunlight off something metal, a spyglass. The man in the black coat was watching. He had been there the whole time. The trip to the courthouse in Whitford felt like a march to the gallows. The new marriage certificate felt flimsy, a paper shield against an enemy they couldn't see. The glint of the spyglass on the ridge haunted Henry's every thought. They weren't just being watched, they were being studied, dissected. The courtroom was small and stuffy, smelling of old paper and stale justice. Constance Eldridge was exactly as Henry had imagined. A woman with a spine of iron and eyes that judged and condemned everything they saw. Beside her sat her lawyer, a slick man named Porter, whose smile never reached his eyes. He radiated a smug confidence that made Henry's fists clench. The judge, a man named Reynolds with tired eyes and a drooping mustache, looked over the case file with a weary sigh. Porter began, his voice smooth and persuasive. He painted a picture of Henry as a dangerous recluse, a man who had isolated himself from society, a man whose family was riddled with a history of mental fragility. He produced a doctor's note, yellowed with age, supposedly detailing Daniel's struggles with paranoia and delusions. A condition, Porter said, his eyes flicking to Henry, that we have reason to believe runs in the family. It was a lie, a masterfully crafted lie. Henry wanted to scream, to show them the journal, to tell them about the men in black coats in the Institute. But how could he? He would sound exactly like the madman Porter was describing. He was trapped. May placed a calming hand on his arm, her touch a silent anchor in the swirling chaos. Then Porter turned his attention to May. And this woman, he sneered, a convenient widow who appears out of nowhere and marries this man a mere week after he takes custody of 4 children he is wholly unprepared to raise. It's not a marriage, Your Honor. It's a desperate act of theater. The judge looked at them, his expression unreadable. I'll hear from the children, he said, his voice a low grumble. Constance went pale. Porter objected, but the judge silenced him with a single look. Rose went first, her voice small but clear. She spoke of the stew Henry had made, of the way May hummed when she baked bread, of how June only stopped crying when Henry held her. She spoke of a home, not a prison. Then it was Wesley's turn. He walked to the front, not with the fear of a child, but with the cold fury of a soldier. He looked directly at Porter, then at the judge. My father wasn't crazy, he said, his voice ringing with conviction. He was scared. He was being hunted. Porter scoffed. Hunted by whom, son? The phantoms of his own troubled mind? No, Wesley said, his voice dropping, commanding the attention of the entire room. By them. He turned and pointed a trembling finger at a man standing in the back of the courtroom. A man in a perfectly tailored black coat, his face impassive. The man from the general store. The man on the ridge. A gasp rippled through the room. The man didn't flinch. His eyes, cold and empty, locked onto Wesley. He's been watching us, Wesley continued, his voice rising. He followed us from town. He was there when our pa... His voice broke. My father told me to protect my sisters. He gave me this. Wesley reached into his coat and pulled out the leather-bound journal. He told me the truth was in here, and he told me to show it to someone who would listen. He opened the journal and read the last entry Daniel had written. The words filled the silent courtroom, a desperate plea from beyond the grave. They are not government. They are not law. They are something else. They created her, and now they want to uncreate her. Her name is June, but that is not what they call her. They call her Specimen 7. Silence. Utter, deafening silence. Judge Reynolds stared at the journal, then at the man in the back of the room. The man in the black coat gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent warning to the judge. But Reynolds, for the first time, looked truly angry. His tired eyes flashed with a spark of old-world justice. He looked at Constance, whose face was a mask of shock and fear. She wasn't just a pawn, she was a terrified one. He looked at Porter, whose smug smile had finally vanished. Then he looked at Henry and May, and the 4 children huddled together. I've heard enough, he boomed, his voice echoing in the small room. He slammed his gavel down. Petition denied. Guardianship granted to Henry and May Granger. This court is adjourned. It was a victory, but a hollow one. As they filed out of the courthouse, the man in the black coat was gone. They had won the battle, but Henry knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they had just started a war. And they had shown the enemy their most powerful weapon, the truth. The ride home was quiet, heavy with the weight of their victory and the dread of what was to come. They had exposed a piece of the secret, and the Institute would not let that stand. As they neared the cabin, Wesley, riding up front with Henry, suddenly pointed. Look! There was someone waiting on their porch, an old man, a stranger, holding a letter in his hand. He looked like a simple farmer, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent. As they pulled up, he stepped forward. Henry Granger? He asked. Henry nodded, his hand instinctively going to the rifle tucked beside him. This is for you, the old man said, handing him the letter. Daniel asked me to deliver it if he didn't make it back. He said you'd know what it meant. Henry took the letter. The paper was crisp, the ink fresh. It was a single page, torn from the very same journal Wesley held. A page Daniel had written and entrusted to this stranger before he'd even sent the children on their way. A final contingency, a final warning. It read, Henry, if you are reading this, the court was a trap. They know about the journal. Run. The key is with the messenger. Holly T. Crane is not a person. It is a place. The place where it all began. Don't let them have her back. You were always the better man. Henry looked up at the old man. The man opened his palm. In it lay a small, ornate brass key. He said you'd need this, the man said. And he said to tell you the black wagon went north. A black wagon, plural. There were more of them. The victory in court was a diversion. While they were fighting a legal battle, the real enemy was closing in. They had been played. Henry looked toward the cabin, his new home, his new family. It wasn't a sanctuary, it was a target. May, he yelled, his voice raw with urgency. Pack a bag. We're leaving. Now. They fled like thieves in the night. There was no time to pack memories, only necessities. Food, water, blankets, and Daniel's journal. The old messenger had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving only the brass key and the cryptic warning. Holly T. Crane. A place. Henry pushed the horses hard, heading not north but west toward the Badlands, hoping to lose any trackers in the harsh, unforgiving terrain. May sat beside him, her face a pale oval in the moonlight, June asleep in her lap. In the back of the wagon, Wesley kept watch, the rifle held tight, while Rose and Lorna huddled together under a quilt, their faces streaked with tears and confusion. "Where are we going?" Rose whispered. "Somewhere safe," May answered, her voice a comforting lie. There was no safe place. Not anymore. For 2 days they traveled, the silence broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the cry of the wind. On the third night, camped in the shelter of a rocky overhang, Henry finally took out the key. It was old, intricate, not for a door or a chest. He studied it by the firelight, turning it over and over. Wesley watched him, his young face etched with worry. "What is it for?" he asked. "I don't know," Henry admitted. He pulled out the journal, hoping for a clue he might have missed. He flipped through the frantic pages, the maps, the notes. Tucked into a small pocket on the inside back cover, he found something he hadn't seen before. A small, folded piece of paper. It was a photograph, a faded black and white image of a woman he didn't recognize. She was beautiful, with sad eyes, and she was holding a baby. The baby was June. He turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back were 3 words: Project Chimera, Specimen 7. And below that, a string of numbers. Not a date, a coordinate. "It's a map," May said, her voice barely a whisper as she looked over his shoulder. "The numbers. They're coordinates for a location." Henry's hands trembled as he cross-referenced the numbers with a tattered map from the journal. The location was deep in the Badlands, an area marked as uninhabited. An old, abandoned mining outpost, according to the map. The name of the mine was printed in small letters. Holly T. Crane. It wasn't just a place. It was her birthplace. The key wasn't for a lock. It was a symbol, a marker. They had to go there. The answers were there. Daniel had been leading them there all along. But as they prepared to leave at dawn, Wesley let out a sharp cry. "Henry, look!" On the ridge opposite their camp, silhouetted against the rising sun, were 3 figures on horseback. Men in black coats. They had been found. There was no time to run. "Get the girls in the cave," Henry yelled at May, grabbing his rifle. "Wesley, with me." The men on the ridge didn't charge. They just sat there watching, blocking their only way out. Then one of them raised a hand, and from the canyon behind them, the sound of an engine echoed. Not a wagon. Something else. A motor vehicle, black and monstrous, kicking up a cloud of dust as it sped toward them. They were completely, utterly trapped. Panic seized him, cold and sharp. But then May's voice cut through the fear. "Henry, the back of the cave. It's a tunnel." It was an old mining shaft, dark and narrow, smelling of damp earth. It was their only chance. "Go!" he screamed, laying down covering fire as the men on horseback finally began their descent. "I'll hold them off!" He fired, the shots echoing through the canyon. He saw one of the riders fall. The black vehicle swerved, its metal body glinting in the sun. Wesley fired alongside him, the boy's fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Go, Henry!" he yelled. "They need you!" Henry hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned and plunged into the darkness of the tunnel, following the sound of his family's terrified retreat. Behind them, the roar of the engine grew louder, and the entrance to the cave was filled with the silhouettes of armed men. They were in the belly of the beast. The tunnel was a labyrinth. They stumbled through the suffocating darkness, May holding a lit match that cast flickering, monstrous shadows on the rock walls. June was crying, her sobs echoing in the tight space. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a small, man-made chamber. It was a dead end, but the chamber wasn't empty. In the center of the room was a metal table, and on the table was a small, locked box. Henry looked at the lock. He looked at the brass key in his hand. He knew with a sudden, chilling certainty that this was it. This was what Daniel had been leading them to. With trembling hands, he inserted the key. It turned. The lock clicked open. Inside the box were not answers. There were vials of a strange, glowing blue liquid. There were syringes. And there was another journal, this one bound in sterile white cloth. A physician's log. Henry opened it. The first entry sent a shock wave of ice through his veins. Project Chimera. Entry 1. The subject specimen 7 has been successfully birthed. The genetic modifications appear stable. She exhibits accelerated growth and cognitive function. But there is an unforeseen side effect, an uncontrolled bioelectric discharge when under emotional distress. She is not a key, she is a weapon, and she is far more powerful than we ever anticipated. A weapon, his June, his sweet, innocent June. Suddenly a blinding light flooded the chamber. They spun around. The men in black coats stood at the entrance to the tunnel, their weapons raised. With them was the man with the scarred face from the depot. He smiled, a cold, predatory smile. "Thank you for bringing her home, Mr. Granger," he said, "and for finding my research. We've been looking for that." He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on June. "We're not giving her to you," May spat, shielding the child with her body. The scarred man laughed. "You have no choice. She belongs to us. We made her." "You made a mistake," Henry growled, raising his rifle. But before he could fire, June, terrified by the shouting and the bright lights, let out a piercing scream. The vials on the table began to vibrate. The lanterns held by the men flickered violently. A low hum filled the air, a sound that felt like it was coming from inside their own skulls. The rock around them trembled. June's eyes were wide, and they were glowing with a faint blue light. The power inside her, the power described in the journal, was lashing out. The scarred man's smile faltered, replaced by a look of awe and fear. "Incredible," he breathed. "It's even stronger than we projected." He took another step forward. "Don't be afraid, child. We're here to help you." "Stay away from her!" Wesley screamed, and he did something impossibly brave and stupid. He charged. He threw himself at the scarred man, knocking him off balance. For a second, chaos erupted. The other men, startled, raised their weapons. Henry saw his chance. "May, now!" he roared. He fired his rifle, not at the men, but at the ceiling of the tunnel. The rock, already unstable from the vibrations, cracked. Dust and pebbles rained down. A huge boulder dislodged and fell, sealing the tunnel entrance completely. They were trapped inside, but the men in black coats were trapped outside. They were safe for the moment, but they were buried alive, deep in the earth, with a child who was a living weapon and no way out. The darkness that followed the cave-in was absolute. The air was thick with dust, choking them. June's cries had subsided into whimpers, her small body trembling in May's arms. The faint blue glow that had emanated from her was gone. The only sound was their own ragged breathing and the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the oppressive blackness. "Is everyone okay?" Henry's voice was a rough rasp. He heard a chorus of shaky affirmations. They were alive. Buried, but alive. He fumbled for the matches, his hands shaking. The first one scraped and died. The second caught, its tiny flame a beacon in the infinite night. In its flickering light, he saw the faces of his family, pale and smeared with dirt, their eyes wide with terror. He saw the physician's journal lying on the floor where he'd dropped it. He saw the box of glowing blue vials, and he saw the wall of rock and rubble that now sealed their tomb. "Wesley," Henry said, his voice steady despite the hammer in his chest. "That was the bravest, dumbest thing I've ever seen. Don't ever do it again." Wesley just nodded, a grim set to his young jaw. He hadn't just been protecting June, he had been avenging his father. "There has to be another way out," May said, her voice strained but determined. "These old mines, they connect. There are air shafts." She was right. Hope, thin and fragile, flickered in the darkness. They spent hours which felt like days searching. They used the pages of the first journal as torches, the story of Daniel's flight fueling their own desperate search for freedom. Finally, they found it. A narrow fissure in the rock, almost hidden behind a curtain of stone. A faint, cool breeze drifted from it. It was a tight squeeze. Henry went first, pushing the box and the journal ahead of him. One by one, they shimmied and crawled through the suffocating darkness, the rock scraping their skin raw. At last, Henry saw it, a patch of gray light. He pushed with all his might and burst out into the pre-dawn twilight, gasping the clean, cold air. He was on the far side of the mountain, a mile from where they had entered. They were free. They stumbled down the mountainside, exhausted, battered but alive. They had the research. They had June, but they had nothing else. No wagon, no food, no weapons but Henry's empty rifle. And they knew the Institute would be hunting them with a renewed fury. They hadn't just stolen their property, they had witnessed her power. They walked for a day, hiding when they heard the distant sound of the motor vehicles scouring the canyons. That night, huddled together for warmth, May looked at Henry, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "What do we do now?" she whispered. "We can't run forever." "No," Henry said, looking at the sleeping form of June. "We can't." He thought of his brother's last words. "You were always the better man." Daniel had run. He had hidden, and it had gotten him killed. Henry would not make the same mistake. "We stop running," he said, a new hard certainty in his voice. "We fight back." "How?" Wesley asked. "It's us against all of them." "Your father mentioned a man," Henry said, remembering the journal, "a man inside the Institute who tried to help him, a Dr. Alistair Finch. He's the one who wrote the second journal. Daniel was trying to reach him before he died." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. They had no idea where Finch was, or if he was even still alive. But he was their only hope. Their journey turned from a flight to a hunt. They traveled by night, stealing food when they had to, becoming the ghosts the Institute had turned them into. Henry used his knowledge of the wild to keep them hidden. May used her quiet strength to keep them together. They made their way to a small railroad town, and Henry used the last of his money to send a coded telegram, a message taken from a cipher in Daniel's journal, to a postbox in a city hundreds of miles away. It was a shot in the dark, a message in a bottle thrown into a vast hostile ocean. "Chimera is loose. Specimen 7 is with me. The research is safe. Need an exit." They waited for 3 days in an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of town, every passing shadow making them jump. On the 4th day, a man appeared. He was old, with kind eyes and a weary face. He looked nothing like the men in black coats. "Mr. Granger?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm Alistair Finch. I got your message. I've been waiting a long time for someone to find that journal." He was real. Daniel's contact was real. Relief washed over Henry so powerfully his knees almost buckled. Dr. Finch explained everything. He was the head of the project, a scientist who had dreamed of curing genetic diseases. His research had been perverted, twisted into a weapons program by a rogue faction led by the scarred man, whose name was Marcus Thorne. Thorne was obsessed with June, believing her to be the key to creating a new breed of human soldier. Finch had been trying to dismantle the project from the inside for years. Daniel had been his only real ally on the outside. "I can get you out," Finch said. "New identities, a new life, far away from here, a place where Thorne and his men will never find you. In exchange," he looked at the white journal in Henry's hands, "I need that research, all of it. I need to burn every last trace of Project Chimera from the face of the earth." It was the choice Henry had been waiting for, a chance to end it. He looked at May, at Wesley, at Rose and Lorna, and finally at June, who was chasing a butterfly in the tall grass, her laughter echoing in the quiet afternoon. She wasn't Specimen 7. She wasn't a weapon. She was just a little girl who deserved a chance to grow up, to be happy, to be safe. He handed the journal to Dr. Finch. "Erase her," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "Make it so she never existed." Finch nodded, a solemn promise in his eyes. "She won't have to be a secret anymore," he said. "She can just be a daughter." 2 weeks later, a family with a different name stepped off a train in a lush, green valley thousands of miles away. They had a deed to a small farm, money in their pockets, and no history to speak of. The father, a quiet man with steady eyes, looked at his wife, a woman with strength etched into the lines of her face. They watched their 4 children run ahead, their laughter carrying on the clean, sweet air. Wesley was teaching Lorna how to skip stones across a clear-running creek. Rose was writing in a new notebook, a small smile on her face, and June was looking up at the sky, her face full of wonder, as a flock of birds soared overhead. They were free. Henry Granger had started as a man who had given up on fatherhood, a man who believed he was meant to be alone. But he had been wrong. He hadn't been cursed. He had been waiting. waiting for the 4 pieces of his heart he never knew were missing. His brother had sent him a storm, and in the heart of that storm, he hadn't found destruction. He'd found his family. He'd found his home. The world is full of hidden stories and secret battles fought by ordinary people who choose to be heroes. Henry's story is a reminder that family isn't always about the blood you share, but about the people you would bleed for. If you were moved by this family's incredible fight for freedom and their refusal to give up on each other, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Thank you for watching.